November 22nd, 1943, 20,000 feet above the black expanse of the North Sea. The outside air temperature is 40 degrees below zero. Inside the rear turret of the Avro Lancaster, a thin layer of perspex is the only shield against a slipstream so cold it can freeze exposed skin in seconds. Condensation turns to ice on the interior of the glass, forcing the gunner to scrape it away with gloved fingernails, desperate to maintain a clear line of sight. The 4 Rolls-Royce Merlin engines drone a constant, vibrating, heavy metal symphony that rattles through the airframe. But back here, separated from the warmth and camaraderie of the fuselage by 2 hydraulic doors, there is only isolation. The gunner sits suspended in the void, rotating his turret slowly, port to starboard, starboard to port. He is the guardian of the crew's blind spot, scanning the infinite darkness for a shadow darker than the night itself. He is not looking where they are going, but where they have been, staring backward into the abyss from which death is most likely to arrive. By the winter of 1942, the war in Europe had calcified into a brutal stalemate of attrition. The German Wehrmacht remained deeply entrenched across the continent, from the French Atlantic coast to the frozen steppes of the Soviet Union. On the ground, the Allies were still gathering their strength, years away from the beaches of Normandy. For the British War Cabinet and the exhausted public at home, the strategic reality was stark. The only way to directly strike the heart of the Third Reich was through the air. But the Royal Air Force's early attempts at daylight precision bombing had been catastrophic, resulting in unsustainable losses of aircraft and men against the formidable Luftwaffe fighter defenses. A fundamental shift in doctrine was required. In February 1942, Air Marshal Arthur Bomber Harris took command of RAF Bomber Command. Harris was a man of cold, unyielding calculus. He recognized that hitting specific factories or rail yards at night, with the navigation technology available at the time, was nearly impossible. His solution was grimly pragmatic: area bombing. The target would no longer be a specific synthetic oil plant, but the industrial city itself, the housing, the infrastructure, and the morale of the German workforce. To execute this campaign of dehousing, Harris needed a weapon capable of carrying unprecedented, destructive power over long distances, night after night. The RAF had struggled with earlier heavy bomber designs. The short Sterling was agile, but limited by a low service ceiling. The Handley Page Halifax was rugged, but initially plagued by performance issues. But then came the aircraft that would define the air war, the Avro Lancaster. Derived from the twin-engine Manchester, the Lancaster was a 4-engine Leviathan, powered by the legendary Rolls-Royce Merlins. It was a masterpiece of utilitarian engineering, ugly to some, beautiful to its crews, and terrifying to those beneath it. The Lancaster possessed a lifting capacity that defied logic. While the American B-17 Flying Fortress, bristling with heavy defensive armament for daylight raids, could carry perhaps 4,000 to 6,000 pounds of bombs on a long-range mission, the Lancaster could haul 14,000 pounds and eventually the 22,000-pound Grand Slam earthquake bomb. It was a flying freight train designed for a singular purpose: the delivery of high explosives and incendiaries to the Ruhr Valley, Hamburg, and Berlin. However, the Lancaster's design philosophy differed radically from its American counterparts. The Americans bet on formations and heavy defensive firepower to fight their way through in daylight. The British bet on the cover of darkness. The Lancaster was painted matte black on its undersides to blend into the night sky. It stripped away heavy armor plating and side-waist gunners to save weight for bombs. It relied on stealth, evasion, and the darkness itself for survival. Yet darkness was not a perfect shield. The Germans had developed a sophisticated night air defense system, the Kammhuber line, a deadly network of radar stations, searchlights, and radar-equipped night fighters like the Messerschmitt Bf 110 and the Junkers Ju 88. These predators hunted by stalking the bomber streams, looking for the telltale exhaust flames of the Merlins or the silhouette of a heavy wing against the stars. The Lancaster, for all its lifting power, was a large, sluggish target when fully loaded. It could not outrun a fighter, and it could not outturn one. This tactical reality placed an immense burden on the defensive capabilities of the aircraft. The Lancaster was not defenseless, but its defenses were concentrated. It typically mounted 3 turrets: a nose turret, a mid-upper turret, and the tail turret. The guns were 303 caliber Brownings, fast-firing but lightweight rifle caliber weapons that lacked the punching power of the German 20mm and 30mm cannons. The defense of the bomber and the lives of the 7 men inside did not rely on shooting down the enemy, but on seeing them first. The doctrine was clear: evasion, not confrontation. If a gunner spotted a fighter early enough, the pilot could maneuver into a violent corkscrew to throw off the attacker's aim and slip back into the shadows. If the gunner failed to see the enemy, the first warning would be cannon shells ripping through the fuselage and fuel tanks. Thus, the war in the air became a duel of eyes and senses. The technology of radar and countermeasures was advancing rapidly, becoming a secret war of window chaff and jamming signals. But ultimately, the safety of the aircraft came down to human vigilance. The Lancaster was merely a delivery system composed of aluminum, hydraulics, and canvas. To function, it required a crew that operated not as individuals, but as a single synchronized organism wired into the aircraft's intercom system. And within that organism, the men manning the turrets held the most precarious position of all. A heavy bomber did not fly itself. To lift a 30-ton Lancaster off a damp runway in Lincolnshire and guide it through 600 miles of hostile darkness required the precise coordination of 7 distinct specialists. This was not a random assembly of soldiers. It was a tight-knit, interdependent hierarchy, often referred to simply as the family. At the front sat the pilot, the aircraft captain, usually an officer, wrestling with the heavy controls. Beside him, on a fold-down seat, was the flight engineer, managing the fuel mix and engine gauges. Behind a black curtain lay the tactical brain of the aircraft, the navigator plotting the course, and the wireless operator listening for signals from base. In the nose, lying prone over the optical sight, was the bomb aimer. These 5 men worked in the relative warmth of the forward fuselage, connected by physical proximity and shared heating ducts. But separated from this main group were the gunners. The mid-upper gunner sat in a bubble atop the fuselage, his feet dangling in a sling, spinning 360 degrees to cover the sky above. And finally, at the extreme rear of the fuselage, past the chemical toilet and the main spar, sat the rear gunner. The process of forming these crews, known as crewing up, was unique in military history. The RAF did not assign men to crews arbitrarily. Instead, hundreds of newly trained airmen were placed in a hangar and told to sort themselves out. Pilots wandered the room looking for navigators who looked reliable. Gunners looked for pilots who looked like they could land in one piece. It was a chaotic, intuitive ritual that relied on gut instinct and personal chemistry. Once formed, a crew lived, ate, drank, and flew together. If they died, they almost always died together. The air gunners, distinguished by the AG brevet on their chests, were a specific breed. While pilots and navigators underwent lengthy academic training, gunners were pushed through an intensive shorter curriculum focused on ballistics, aircraft recognition, and turret manipulation. This meant that gunners were often the youngest members of the crew, sometimes barely 18 years old. They came from every corner of the Commonwealth. British factory workers, Canadian farmers, Australian sheep shearers, volunteers drawn by the allure of flight, only to find themselves assigned the most dangerous seat in the war. The attrition rate was horrific. In the early years of the offensive, the statistical life expectancy of a rear gunner was measured in weeks, sometimes just 5 or 6 operations. They were the first to be targeted by enemy fighters attacking from the rear, and in the event of a catastrophic explosion or a spin, the G-forces at the tail made bailing out nearly impossible. Yet, despite the lowly rank, usually sergeant or flight sergeant, the rear gunner held the lives of the officers in his hands. The crew relied on his voice over the intercom. A calm corkscrew port, "Go," meant survival. A moment of hesitation or a frozen microphone meant destruction. This responsibility required a specific temperament. A gunner had to possess the patience of a sniper and the paranoia of a sentry. He had to suppress the natural human urge to fire at shadows, knowing that a muzzle flash was a beacon to every night fighter within 10 miles. He had to remain silent for hours, listening to the static, fighting the crushing weight of sleep deprivation, all while his body was subjected to an environment physically hostile to human life. The rear turret was not just a battle station. It was a prison cell made of aluminum and glass, bolted to the end of a vibrating metal tube. To understand the war of the bomber, one must understand the specific, claustrophobic reality of that turret. The workspace of the rear gunner was a marvel of compression. The standard Frazer-Nash FN-20 turret was a circular capsule, hydraulically powered, bolted to the extreme tail of the fuselage. To enter, the gunner had to climb through the fuselage, past the tail wheel, plug into the intercom and oxygen points, and then slide backward into the seat. Once he was strapped in, he would rotate the turret to face the rear. The steel doors behind him would slide shut, severing his physical connection to the rest of the crew. From that moment on, for the next 8 to 10 hours, his world was reduced to a sphere of perspex and steel, barely larger than a telephone booth. The gunner did not merely sit in the turret. He wore it. His knees were cramped against the firing controls, his chest pressed against the sight. The controls were simple but sensitive. A dead man's handle grip that controlled the rotation and elevation. Squeeze the levers, and the hydraulics hissed, swinging the 4 barrels with surprising speed. Press the firing button, and the guns would unleash a torrent of lead. But the power of the turret was deceptive. The primary weapon of the Lancaster gunner was the Browning 303 Mark II machine gun. The turret housed 4 of them, fed by long ammunition tracks that snaked back into the fuselage, providing 20,000 to 500 rounds per gun. The Browning was a reliable weapon, capable of spewing 1,150 rounds per minute. At night, a 4-second burst looked like a hose of fire, a terrifying display of pyrotechnics. But ballistically, it was a relic of the First World War. The 303 was a rifle-caliber bullet, lethal against infantry, but woefully underpowered against the armored skin of a German Junkers Jew, 88 or Messerschmitt Bf 110. A Lancaster gunner had to be within 400 yards to have any hope of penetrating a night fighter's armor. Conversely, the German fighters were armed with 20mm and later 30mm cannons, weapons that could tear a wing off a bomber from 800 yards away, well outside the effective range of the Brownings. The gunner was fighting a sniper with a shotgun. He knew that if he opened fire, he wasn't likely to destroy the enemy. He was simply trying to dazzle them, to force them to break off their attack. But before he could worry about the Germans, the gunner had to survive the environment. At operational altitude, usually between 18,000 and 22,000 feet, the air temperature plummeted to minus 40 degrees Celsius. The wind chill factor, exacerbated by the slipstream rushing past the turret at 200 miles per hour, created conditions indistinguishable from the Arctic. Survival depended on the kapok inner suit and the electrically heated Taylor buoyancy suit. This clumsy, heavy garment was wired with heating elements that plugged into the aircraft's electrical system. It was the gunner's life support. If a fuse blew or a wire snapped, a common occurrence in the vibrating airframe, the cold would set in instantly. Frostbite was a silent, insidious enemy. Commanders reported gunners being lifted out of their turrets at the end of a raid, their hands frozen into claws, requiring amputation. To prevent the perspex from icing up, the gunner had to constantly manage the airflow or physically scrape the frost away. To maintain consciousness in the thin air, he wore a heavy rubber oxygen mask, which grew clammy and wet with condensation, freezing against his face. If he needed to clear a jammed gun, he had to remove his heavy outer gloves. There was a strict rule: never touch the metal of the breech block with bare skin. At 40 below zero, skin bonds to steel instantly. To pull your hand away meant stripping the flesh from the bone. In this frozen, vibrating, deafeningly loud capsule, the gunner was expected to maintain a state of hypervigilance. He could not sleep. He could not daydream. He could not look away. He was the eyes in the back of the crew's head, and the margin for error was non-existent. The primary duty of the rear gunner was not to kill, but to detect. This required a specific visual discipline known as scanning. He could not simply stare at one spot. The human eye quickly loses focus in a featureless field of black. Instead, the gunner had to keep his eyes moving constantly, using his peripheral vision, which is more sensitive to movement and low light, to pick up the faint contrast of a fighter against the stars or the darker earth below. He swept the sky in a relentless figure-8 pattern. Check the port quarter, check the starboard quarter, look down into the cone of darkness beneath the tail, check the astrodome above. Repeat every 30 seconds for 8 hours. The monotony was hypnotic, yet a single lapse meant death. A speck of dirt on the perspex could look like a distant fighter. A distant fighter could look like a speck of dirt. The gunner had to distinguish between a harmless meteor, another Lancaster drifting out of formation, and a stalking Junkers Jew 88 night fighter. The relationship between the rear gunner and the pilot was the most critical tactical link on the aircraft. The gunner was the pilot's rear-view mirror. When a fighter was spotted, the gunner didn't just shout, "Bandit!" He had to be calm, precise, and authoritative. "Corkscrew port, go!" Upon that command, the pilot would instantly throw the heavy bomber into a violent evasive maneuver. He would bank sharply to the left and dive, gaining speed, then pull up hard to the right, climbing. This corkscrew was designed to ruin the fighter's firing solution and force them to reacquire the target. For the pilot in the nose, The maneuver was physically demanding. For the rear gunner, situated at the end of the long fuselage lever, it was physically punishing. The G-forces were amplified at the tail. As the plane whipped around, the gunner was crushed into his seat, the blood draining from his head, his vision graying out. Then, seconds later, he was weightless, slamming against the turret straps, his stomach churning. All the while, he had to keep his eyes on the fighter, firing bursts to keep its head down, and directing the pilot. Keep turning. He's still there. Now corkscrew starboard. But the terror wasn't just what he could see. It was what he couldn't see. By 1943, the Luftwaffe had introduced a weapon that terrified bomber command crews. Schräge Musik, jazz music. German night fighters were fitted with upward-firing cannons mounted in the fuselage. These hunters would approach a Lancaster from below, matching its speed and altitude, hiding in the absolute blind spot underneath the wings and bomb bay, a place neither the mid-upper nor the rear gunner could see. The German pilot would simply look up, aim at the fuel tanks in the wing roots, and pull the trigger. The first sign of attack for the Lancaster crew was not a sighting, but the wing suddenly erupting into flames. This constant, invisible threat bred a deep, gnawing paranoia. Every shadow beneath the tail could be a predator, waiting to strike. This was the mental toll of the rear turret, a paradoxical mix of extreme boredom and extreme terror. The gunner was isolated, freezing and exhausted, staring into a void that wanted to kill him. He listened to the chatter of the crew, the navigation updates, the bomb aimer's checks, but he remained apart, a solitary sentinel guarding the back door. As the flight hours dragged on, the droning of the engines and the rhythmic sway of the aircraft lulled the brain towards sleep, but the adrenaline of the approaching target city snapped the mind back to rigid attention. Ahead, the horizon began to glow with a sinister, pulsing orange light. The darkness was ending. They were entering the target zone. 01 to 22 hours. The intercom crackles. Enemy coast ahead. Prepare for action. The drone of the engine seems to deepen as the Lancaster crosses the threshold into the most heavily defended airspace on Earth. Below, the blackout of occupied Europe gives way to the industrial heartland of the Ruhr Valley, known grimly to the crews as Happy Valley. For the rear gunner, the darkness of the North Sea is replaced by a chaotic, terrifying light show. Miles ahead, the sky is punctured by Christmas trees, the cascading red and green target indicators dropped by the Pathfinder force, marking the aiming point for the main bomber stream. High above, the master bomber, circling in a fast de Havilland Mosquito, broadcasts corrections over the radio, his voice calm amidst the carnage. Hello, King 5. You're undershooting. Bomb 2 miles north of the red TIs. Over. Then come the searchlights. They stand like pillars of solid white marble, sweeping the sky in rigid geometric patterns. Hundreds of them. The gunner shrinks into his kapok suit, feeling the psychological weight of the light. If a beam catches the Lancaster, the cockpit fills with a blinding brilliance that destroys night vision instantly. This is the coning. Once a bomber is caught by a master blue beam, dozens of other lights snap onto it, forming a teepee of light. The gunner knows what follows. The flak. Heavy 80mm and 100 C anti-aircraft shells do not streak like traces. They simply appear. 1 second, empty black space. The next, a blossom of black smoke and a dull orange flash. The sound reaches the rear turret a split second later. A crump, crump, crump that shakes the airframe. When the bursts are close, the shrapnel hitting the aluminum skin sounds like a handful of gravel thrown against a tin roof. The gunner is helpless against flak. He cannot shoot it. He cannot dodge it. He is a passenger in a glass bubble, moving at 200 miles per hour through a storm of steel. He grips the handles, his knuckles white inside the leather gloves, forcing himself to look away from the explosions, back into the dark. Because the flak is not the only threat. Suddenly, the flak stops. The searchlights douse. The sky goes black again. The silence is worse than the noise. The cessation of ground fire is a specific, coordinated signal from the German ground controllers. It means the airspace has been handed over. The hunters have entered the stream. The gunner's heart hammers against his ribs. He scans the port quarter. Nothing. He scans the starboard quarter. Nothing. He looks down into the dark earth. Then a flicker. A shape darker than the night, sliding across the star field at 4 o'clock high. A twin-engine shadow. Corkscrew starboard, go, go, go! The world instantly tilts on its axis. The pilot slams the yoke over, and the heavy bomber groans under the stress, rolling sharply to the right and diving. In the rear turret, the G-forces hit like a physical blow, crushing the gunner into the floor of his seat. His chin is forced down onto his chest, the blood draining from his head, vision narrowing to a tunnel. Through the perspex, the tracer fire erupts, long glowing streams of light reaching out into the darkness. The gunner fights the weight of gravity, wrestling the hydraulics to keep his sights on the shadow. He squeezes the triggers. The 4 Brownings roar, the vibration shuddering through his arms, filling the small turret with the acrid, sulphurous smell of cordite. He watches his own tracers arc toward the enemy, red lines converging in the distance. The German Ju-88 returns fire, its 20mm cannons blinking rapidly from the nose. Luminous green orbs whiz past the turret, missing by feet, disappearing into the void. Climbing, climbing port. The pilot shouts over the intercom. The Lancaster heaves upward, the engine screaming at full boost. The gunner is now weightless, floating against his harness straps, his stomach lurching into his throat. He swings the turret left, searching for the fighter. The enemy pilot, denied a steady shot, peels away, diving into the safety of the lower darkness to avoid the lethal defensive fire. Clear, clear astern, the gunner gasps into his mask, his breath ragged. The bomber levels out, the airframe shivering as it settles back into steady flight. The silence rushes back in, heavier than before. The gunner checks his ammunition tracks, hundreds of rounds spent in seconds. He wipes the sweat from his eyes, ignoring the freezing cold that instantly begins to creep back in. His hands are trembling, but he forces them to grip the control handles. He cannot rest. The fighter is gone, but the night is full of them. Below, the target city is a cauldron of fire. The bombs have dropped. The load is lightened, and the aircraft feels different, more responsive, eager to climb. The pilot turns the nose toward the west, toward England. But the relief is premature. They are only halfway through the gauntlet. The flight home is often where the fatigue kills you. The flight home is a different kind of torture. The adrenaline that fueled the combat encounter evaporates, leaving behind a crushing narcotic exhaustion. The gunner sits in his turret, his body aching, his ears ringing from the engine noise and the gunfire. The cold seems to penetrate deeper now, settling into the marrow of his bones. He checks his watch. 04 Bouillon. Still 2 hours to the English coast. This is the time when mistakes happen. The German intruders often follow the bomber stream back across the channel, waiting for the crews to relax as they approach their own airfields. The gunner must force his heavy eyelids to stay open, scanning the grey pre-dawn light for silhouettes. Finally, the coast of Lincolnshire appears, a jagged line of darker grey against the sea. The runway lights of the airfield flicker on, a welcoming T shape in the mist. The pilot calls for landing gear. The hydraulic whine is the sweetest sound the crew has heard all night. Touchdown. The tires screech against the tarmac, and the heavy bomber settles onto its suspension. As the aircraft taxis to its dispersal point and the engines sputter and die, the silence that falls over the airfield is profound. The gunner unclips his oxygen mask, the rubber peeling away from his face, leaving deep red welts. He disconnects his intercom and heating plug. Struggling to move his stiffened limbs, he opens the turret doors and rotates them to the exit position, sliding backward into the fuselage. The smell inside the plane is a mix of stale sweat, oil, and the faint, lingering scent of fear. They climb out onto the wet grass, their legs wobbly. The ground crew is already there, checking the airframe for damage. They count the holes. Sometimes there are none. Sometimes the fuselage looks like a colander, peppered with shrapnel. Sometimes they find a crew member slumped over his station, wounded or dead, requiring the grim task of extraction before the sun fully rises. The crew is trucked to the operations block for the washout, the debriefing. The room is thick with cigarette smoke and the smell of wet wool. Intelligence officers move from table to table, asking gentle but probing questions. Did you see the target markers? What was the flak intensity? Did you claim a fighter? The men answer in monosyllables, clutching mugs of tea laced with navy rum. They are young men with the eyes of the elderly. They have aged 10 years in 10 hours. They look around the room, counting the other crews. There are empty tables, a gap in the chatter. Where's B for Baker? Someone asks. Didn't see them after the coast, another replies quietly. There is no weeping, no dramatic speeches, just a silent acknowledgement. 7 men. 7 empty beds in a Nissen hut, somewhere on the base. Their personal effects, letters, photos, civilian clothes, will be quietly packed away by the Committee of Adjustment before the surviving roommates return to sleep. The war does not pause for grief. The physical return was only half the journey. The psychological return was often impossible. The RAF, aware of the crushing mental strain, operated a ruthless system to maintain combat effectiveness. There was no PTSD in the medical dictionaries of 1943. There was only LMF, lack of moral fibre. If a gunner, broken by the stress of watching friends disintegrate in midair, or the terror of being trapped in a burning turret, refused to fly, he wasn't treated as a casualty of war. He was often stripped of his rank, his flying brevet torn from his uniform, and discharged in disgrace or assigned to menial ground duties. This draconian policy hung over the mess halls like a shroud. Men flew not just out of duty, but out of fear of shame. They climbed back into their turrets night after night, suppressing the trembling in their hands, knowing the odds were mathematically stacked against their survival. The statistics were grimly binary. A tour of duty was 30 operations. The statistical loss rate was often around 4 to 5% per mission. Mathematically, a crew member was not expected to survive a full tour. In fact, Bomber Command would suffer the highest casualty rate of any British unit in the war, higher than the infantry in Normandy. of the 125,000 aircrew who served, 55,173 were killed, a 44.4% death rate. Inside the family of the Lancaster, the rear gunner was often the first to die, his position being the focal point of enemy attacks. Yet, their sacrifice achieved a strategic strangulation of the Third Reich that is often overlooked. While the ethics of area bombing remain a subject of intense historical debate, the military consequence was undeniable. The German war machine was forced to turn inward. Thousands of 88mm anti-aircraft guns, weapons that could have decimated Allied tanks in Russia or Normandy, were pinned down defending German cities. The Luftwaffe was bled white, its expert pilots lost in the night skies over Berlin and Hamburg, leaving the skies over the D-Day beaches virtually empty. The Lancaster gunner, freezing in his solitary box, was fighting a war of attrition that broke the back of the Luftwaffe. He did not win the war with a single shot, but by his mere presence, night after relentless night, forcing the enemy to expend its dwindling strength to stop him. When the war ended in May 1945, the roar of the Merlins finally faded from the skies over Europe. The surviving Lancasters were scrapped, melted down into aluminum ingots to rebuild the very world they had helped destroy. But the legacy of the man who flew them remains etched in the silence that followed. To be a rear gunner in Bomber Command was to experience war in a way no other soldier did. The infantryman runs toward the enemy. The fighter pilot chases them. But the rear gunner spent his war looking backward. He watched the coastline of England fade away, watched the flames of the target city recede into the distance, watched the trace of fire chasing him down. He was a witness to the aftermath of his own actions, constantly saying goodbye to the safety of home, suspended in a glass bubble at the very edge of survival. They were not professional killers. They were civilians in uniform, clerks, mechanics, students, volunteers who answered a call that demanded everything. They bound themselves together in crews, forging a brotherhood in the freezing dark that was stronger than blood. They relied on each other not just for survival, but for sanity. Today, the 55,173 men of Bomber Command who never returned are remembered not for the destruction they wrought, but for the courage they maintained in the face of impossible odds. They flew into the heart of the enemy's strength, night after night, knowing that the most likely outcome was a grave in the sky. The Lancaster gunner's vigil was a lonely one. He sat with his back to the future, guarding his friends, freezing in the slipstream of history. His war was cold, dark, and terrifyingly short. But in that darkness, he shone with a quiet, desperate bravery that defined a generation.